All right, so we're gonna record notes on chapter 1 in class, which means that you're gonna need your notebook and a writing utensil. Again, pencil is probably preferable, since that way if you make mistakes, you can erase and fix them. Since the chapter 1 notes are not that hard and not that long, I'm gonna actually ask you guys to take them down in your own words instead of giving you a template. And we'll see how far that goes going on to the other chapters because some of them are a lot more complex. So I might have to make those easier and give you guys like preset templates to write into. I also am kind of curious how many of you guys have printers at home, because if you have a printer at home, it does make it a lot easier for me to send you fill in the blank notes versus having you write all of the notes down or doing notes online, because handwriting actually leads to a lot better memorization of material than typing does. Okay, without further ado, we're gonna get started on the notes. Again, I'm going to ask sometimes that you pause and jot things down. If you ever feel the need to just pause on your own and jot things down, that also totally works. That's the benefit of having a pre-recorded lecture, so that whenever you feel like you need to gather your thoughts and write something down so you don't forget it, or if you need to pause, write down the slide, and then listen to me talk and then jot down as I talk, that's also another super good way. So it's up to your preference, but we're gonna start out with something kind of easy. So let me move this down here. So the do now would have been to turn in your lab. So at this point, if you're in class watching this video for the chapter 1 notes, you're going to have turned in your lab report, so that I can grade it and put it into focus for you. And then kind of to change gears, I'm going to ask you to think about as many characteristics of life as you can. So after you've written down the date at the top of this page and written down the title for this section of notes as chapter 1, underneath, try to list as many characteristics of life as you can. So that means anything that all living things do or have. So I'm going to ask that you pause the video and try to list as many as you can. All right, now that you've listed as many as you can, let's look at the objective. So we're going to be talking about describing specific examples of conserved core biological processes that show common ancestry of all life justifying evolution. So that's kind of the intro chapter, which is chapter 1 into AP Bio. And let's kind of see how your list of characteristics of life compares to the actual full list. Right. So here we can see one thing is that living things are made of one or more cells. And that's just a fact, right? They are at least one cell, like bacteria are tiny, tiny, tiny and made up of one cell. And then there's things like us, like trees, like elephants that are made up of thousands of millions of billions of cells because we're a lot larger. The second thing is that living things display organization, right? Organization makes processes more efficient. So if you, instead of having separate organs for your digestive system, only had one big boiling pot where everything was poured into, digestion would take a lot longer, be a lot slower, and then your nutrients wouldn't necessarily go where they need to go. So having organization and your digestive system being one example of that makes the whole process of metabolism a lot faster, and it makes it work a lot better. Okay, so the larger the organism, the more organization it usually has. The third one is that living things grow and develop. So the example that I always use is that you're never the same size right now as you were when you were born, because you've had a lot of time to grow since then because you've been intaking nutrients, right? And you're growing from being a child to reaching sexual maturity, right? To becoming an adult. And all living things do that, whether or not they actually grow in size, right? Because bacteria don't necessarily grow in size, but or they can, but they can grow into more complex structures. They can develop into a colony. So it's some kind of growth and development is demonstrated by something that all things that are living. Living things can also reproduce. So without reproducing, there is no next generation, right? So living things always find a way to reproduce. It's just part of fitness. It's a part of natural selection. It's a part of life, right? The next one is that the next characteristic of life is that living things respond to stimuli. So that means that anything that is changing or affecting an organism, whether it's internal or external, means that the organism is going to react to it, right? An easy example is if your sibling is annoying you and they keep calling your name and nagging and nagging and nagging for your attention. You're going to respond at some point, whether it be spanking them, or it's going to be yelling at them, or walking away so that you can ignore them, right? Other ones include when you go outside and it's cold, it makes your skin grow little goosebumps, right? That's responding to stimuli. You can't even help that. It just happens naturally, right? So some responses are not like learned responses, like you choose to make them, and some of them come from just the way that your existence has developed. The next one, and the third to last one, is that living organisms require energy. So we already know that plants require energy and it comes from the sun, and they make their own food and then they use that food. Then there are consumers that can't make their own food, but instead they consume things, obviously by their name, to gain energy. They break it down. For example, like us, we have a digestive system. And then once they break it down, then they have energy that can help support life, help support organ function, and all those important things. The second to last point that's a characteristic of life is maintaining homeostasis. So homeostasis is really important because if you don't maintain certain balances within like your membranes, within your organs, within your, even within the water inside of your body, then you can easily die and not be able to survive certain environments. So an easy example that I always bring it back to is body temperature. So normal human body temperature is somewhere between 97 and 99 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're sick, it can either go higher or lower. Usually it's higher because you're developing a fever, right? If your body temperature gets too low, you can develop something like hypothermia. And hypothermia generally leads to death if untreated because with low body temperature, a lot of your digestive processes stop working. A lot of your enzymatic processes that lead to you breaking down certain chemicals in your body stop happening. And there's all kinds of toxic chemicals wandering around your body right now, but your body's actually breaking them all down and then getting rid of them. If those processes are stopped because maybe the temperature doesn't match, or it's too acidic, or it's too basic, or it's too even just too salty, right? Then you can't maintain homeostasis anymore. And it's super easy that when you're not within a range of temperature, salinity, pH, all of those things, then life doesn't exist, right? So a characteristic of life would be to be able to maintain those and maintain a balance. The last thing is living things adapt over time, right? So adaptations don't occur in individual organisms. They occur in groups of organisms and over a long period of time. So the kind of explanation for that is you're not going to just one day be born into a different species, right? Every organism inside of a population or inside of a species is slightly different. Nothing is perfectly identical except for like the corn that and like the fruits that we breed as humans, but that's artificial breeding. In nature, there's always variation. And sometimes the variation is good and sometimes it's bad, depending on how the environment is at the time, right? Right now with climate change, a lot of things are changing, and maybe something that was good in this environment 100 years ago is no longer good. And so the organisms that best fit in the environment are going to survive better and reproduce. And in doing so, they are able to pass their genetics on, and then their traits are going to be more prominent and more often seen in the next generation. And if that keeps happening over and over time as the environment changes and the populations that best fit the environment are the ones that are surviving and having babies, then when you look at the same species down the line, maybe 100, 200 years compared to its ancestors, they're actually going to be really, really different, right? So these are just some characteristics of life. Hopefully you listed at least a couple of them because they're kind of, if you think hard enough, all living things do have these. And whether or not you stated them exactly correct like this, if you were close, it's kudos to you, okay? So again, we're going over chapter 1 notes today. It's not a really long chapter, so we'll cover it. And it's going to be kind of light because I just bombarded you with work on Monday. And your homework is going to be the chapter 1 textbook summary and let me change that. I already have it written down. So this is actually going to be the chapter 2 textbook summary and Learn Smart. And that's not actually due Friday. That's actually going to be due next time I see you, which is going to be next Tuesday. Sorry, I'm writing on my computer right now, and this is kind of hard. But you get the point, okay? So chapter 2 textbook summary and Learn Smart is going to be due Tuesday because you should have already turned in your chapter 1 summary and Learn Smart to me by this class period. Now, let's go over these slowly. I don't want to overwhelm you right now. So the first thing we're going to have you guys kind of chill and write down is levels of organization found in biology. So we're going from smallest to largest. So in the next space underneath where you just wrote about characteristics of life, I would like for you to write down the levels of biological organization. And you don't have to write it the same way that I wrote this. You can write it in any way that makes sense to you. You can write it in just a list. You can write it in a big diagram that gets bigger, bigger, bigger in circles of which one encompasses which one. So the smallest one is an atom, right? That's the smallest individual particle that has an identity is an atom. And when you have a bunch of atoms together, then you can get organelles. Now, that's not to be confused with organs because organs are things like your stomach and your intestine and your skin, right? Those are a lot bigger scale. We're still on a microscopic scale right now. In fact, this is almost on an electron microscopic scale, which is even smaller than the typical microscope you'll be using in class. When you have a bunch of organelles and they work together, they are in a cell, okay? So you have atom makes organelles and a bunch of organelles together like a nucleus, a Golgi bodies, endoplasmic reticulum, the cell membrane, cytoplasms, ribosomes, those are all together, they become a cell. Now, a cell is the smallest structure that can be alive. We just said that, right? For example, bacteria and archaea, they are individual cells. And when you have a bunch of cells of the same purpose and the same job that work together and are grouped together, you have tissue. Again, that's not Kleenex. That's going to be things like your muscle, your bones. They're all uniform, right? And there's a lot of them. And they're all composed of the same type of cell because they all have one singular job and they do it all together. So that's tissue, right? When you have a bunch of different tissues that work together, for example, you can have lining tissues like on the inside of your stomach. You can have muscles because your stomach is actually contracting and smashing your food. You can have other tissues that are actually similar to your skin that make sure that they slough off and are replaced within each day because your stomach acid is actually affecting them every single day, right? And then you have absorbent tissues that have a lot of blood vessels inside of them to help bring nutrients out from your stomach. So a bunch of different tissues working together produce an organ like a stomach. Now, an organ by itself isn't the most useful thing, right? It also just has one main job, but it's usually part of an organ system, which has a larger overall function for the entire body. So if you know which organ system the stomach is a part of, then that's great because you should have known from taking biology before, right? So an organ like the stomach is part of an organ system like the digestive system. Now, if you have a bunch of organ systems like your nervous system, your digestive system, your reproductive system, your excretory, respiratory, lymphatic system, right, your skeletal system, all of those added together become an organism, right? So organisms can't exist unless there are cells. And cells can't exist unless they're organelles, and organelles can't exist unless they're atoms, right? This all is reliant on each other. If you have a bunch of the same kind of organism in one area, then you have a population. For example, the human population of Texas, right? It's all humans, it's all in one area, it's all in Texas, right? So it's all one species in one area. Now, if you go and have multiple populations together, then you have a community. And now I'm not talking about your neighborhood community. No. This is different, right? In science and community is populations of different species that are in an area and interacting with each other. For example, in a forest, that could be foxes, deer, rabbits, lizards, right? They all interact with each other, whether that just be living near each other, eating some of the same foods, maybe eating each other, right? But they are different species, populations interacting with each other that make a community. Now, a community plus its abiotic factors like water, air, sunlight, right? All of those things plus the separate populations interacting with each other make up an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is generally what you think about when you think about like somebody tells you they went camping in the woods and you picture the woods in your head. Usually you think about the animals, the birds, the trees, the grass, the dirt, and you think about the wind and the feeling of the air inside of the woods, because it's different from out here, right? And all of those together are your ecosystem. It's the interactions of all the abiotic and biotic factors in that area. And on a broader spectrum, we have biomes, which are large patches across continents that have the same kind of climate, right? So there's like tundra, there's desert, right? There's different kinds of forests, and they're all really, really big patches. For example, part of the Northern American continent, most of the like northern half of the North American continent is one biome, because they all have the same kind of large tree forests that change leaves when the seasons change, right? So when a large patch of land has the same characteristics uniform throughout the entire area, then it's usually a biome, because the climate there is pretty much the same. And then there are different patches across Earth, right? So if you go up to like the Arctic or if you go up to the Arctic or down to Antarctica, then you have tundra approaching those like icy lands, right? And all of those areas have similar characteristics to each other as well. So those are biomes. And then you have the biosphere, which is the entire Earth basically for us, anywhere that life exists. So it extends into the air because we have things like birds and microbials that live in the air. And then it also goes pretty deep down into the oceans and into the soil as well, because there are living organisms. In fact, as humans, we still haven't fully explored the entire ocean, which is both scary and intriguing. Next, I'm going to ask you to pause and write down notes on this section. So there are 3 domains of life, and I've listed some characteristics for you to look at as well. So the first one is archaea, and these are prokaryotic, which means that they do not have a nucleus, right? They are single-celled, which means that they require a microscope to see them, and they live in extreme environments, right? So, and by extreme, I don't mean like extreme sports, like skiing, snowboarding, right? I don't mean experts. I mean more like environments where it would be hard for you to live or sustain living without any equipment, right? So if you were going to go to Antarctica, would you be able to go there without snow gear? No, right? You're going to be too cold, you're going to get hypothermia, and you're going to die. But there are archaea that are found living inside of the ice there. In fact, they don't even need air to live there, right? There are archaea found at the bottom of the ocean in thermal vents. They just do chemosynthesis to get their energy. They use the chemicals from the sulfur in the vents, and they produce food and energy for themselves. And it's kind of extreme stuff that we could never imagine doing, right? Bacteria, on the other hand, are very similar to archaea in their size, and that's pretty much it, right? They're prokaryotic, they don't have a nucleus, but bacteria live in normal conditions, aka any conditions that we would live in, right? So that means that the temperature range isn't going too far below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not getting too hot either, right? Because bacteria will die if it's too hot or too cold, similar to humans and most other animals. And then eukaryotes are eukaryotic, obviously, right? That means that they have a nucleus. They can be single or multicellular. So there are some really, really small eukaryotes that have the nucleus, and then they have maybe some more complex organelles than a prokaryote. And then they might have a tail that helps them swim, or little fibers that help them swim. And then that's it. They exist happily and tinily like that. There are plenty that are multicellular as well, because examples are like us, like elephants, like dogs. Plants are also, fungi are also, right? They're multicellular life forms that are eukaryotic because they have nuclei. And pretty much all eukaryotes live in normal conditions, right? There are some that live in kind of extreme areas, like in the deep, deep ocean, like anglerfish. And they have different adaptations that let them live there. Like they have softer bodies, so the pressure in the water actually isn't overwhelming and collapsing their bodies, right? A lot of them don't have eyes anymore, because what's the point of growing eyes if you can't see anyways, right? But they've made them into normal conditions, even though thinking about living at the bottom of the ocean is still kind of extreme. Okay, so moving on, we don't actually have that much more to go through. To define evolution, I'm going to have you guys write this down. You can write it down exactly how it is, or you can write it down in a paraphrased way after you read it for yourself. So to define evolution, it is any genetic change in a population that is inherited over several generations, right? These changes may be small or large, noticeable or not so noticeable. It also includes the idea that all of life is connected and can be traced back to one common ancestor. So genetic changes, like I said before when we were talking about the characteristics of life, are what produce variation. And variation allows different rates of survivability in the changing environments that we have on Earth. And then if there are different rates of survivability, then there are different rates of which organisms produce offspring, right? So every generation is different. And as the differences increase from the ancestor, right, you start to see that maybe new species are evolving, or the species that the ancestor was no longer exists, or that the both species coexist. They just tend to prefer and live in different environments, and at some point maybe they're just not the same anymore and they can't interbreed anymore. So all of life is connected and can be traced back to one common ancestor, which was the first thing that was alive, right? The first thing that was alive and able to reproduce. The next thing I'm going to have you write down. So if you need to pause again, you can always pause and copy down the slides, or you can wait and then choose to paraphrase it at the end. So to define natural selection, it is the process by which heritable means that you can inherit or it can be passed down. The process by which heritable traits increase an organism's chances for survival and reproduction. Survival and reproduction basically meaning fitness in science, right? These traits are favored than less beneficial traits. Originally proposed by Charles Darwin, natural selection is the process that results in the evolution of organisms. Let's just say organisms. So again, fitness is different when there's variation in the population. And natural selection isn't some like godlike force that's going through and picking out who's going to survive and who's not going to survive. It's honestly just chance, right? When there's variations in a population, different organisms have different chances of survival because they're different now. If they were all the same and a disease struck through a population and everybody had the same immune system, then everybody would either be weak to it or strong to it, right? So if everybody was weak to it in the population, then everybody would just die from it. And then nobody would survive, and then the fitness would be zero because then nobody would be reproducing. But if there's variation, then immune systems are different, right? So some may be reacting some more strongly, some may be faster at recovering, some may not recover because they're weaker to certain diseases. And having those differences means that the strongest ones for that current condition survive and are able to reproduce. And that's what fitness is. So the example I have here is this picture of mice populations, right? So if you look at the mice, some of them blend into the rocks, some of them don't. The problem is that their bird predators have pretty good eyesight. And so if you don't blend in, then you're probably going to get picked off and eaten. Now, if you get picked off and eaten, you ain't surviving to reproduce, right? So if more tan mice get eaten and the gray mice are more likely to survive, then the gray mice are also going to be more able to reproduce, right? So if you look in the next generation after there's reproduction, there's actually a larger number of gray mice than tan mice, when in the beginning it was actually more tan mice because these birds be picking off the tan mice, so they can't be having no tan mice babies anymore. Okay, so this last thing is kind of a short write-up that I want you guys to do. So here is a statement. Unity and diversity in life. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to use common conserved characteristics or processes to justify two organisms are related by a common ancestor. So I'm going to compare humans and bacteria as an example. And then once you kind of read through and understand my example, then you're going to pick two organisms and you're going to explain similarly how they could be related by a common ancestor, whether it be by processes, by looks, by where they live. You can look those all up on the internet to figure those out. Okay, so the human and bacteria example I have here is humans and bacteria both use DNA as their genetic material, right? So that's a similarity. About 50% of a typical bacteria's genes are present in humans. So we actually share 50% of the same genes that bacteria have in each of our cells. Humans and bacteria both use glycolysis to split glucose into 2 pyruvates for a source of energy, ATP. So we'll get into this detail a little bit more further down the line when we actually get into the units of cellular respiration. But yeah, our metabolic processes are still very similar or almost the same. Both humans and bacteria have a cell membrane, right? Inside of the bacteria cell wall, they have a cell membrane, as do all human cells, right? The difference is that humans don't have a cell wall. So if you wanted to get into the details, there are differences, but we're looking for similarities, right? Because there is unity in life. Humans and bacteria transcribe DNA into RNA, right? We learned about DNA transcription and then translation, right? That gets translated into proteins. So in order to build proteins, to build a physical structure, you got to translate your DNA that humans and bacteria both have into a messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA goes out to the cytoplasm and then gets translated into proteins there with ribosomes. And then lastly, humans and bacteria link the same 20 amino acids in different order to create proteins. So we use the same building blocks. And a lot of the times we build the same kinds of proteins. Not all bacteria can build the same proteins as humans, and not all humans can build the same proteins as bacteria, right? That makes us different organisms. But we're using the same building blocks. So that's some kind of similarity between humans and bacteria, okay? So after kind of reviewing the example that I did, you are going to pick 2 organisms. So make sure you list what they are, and then you're going to write it out. You can type it out if you want to, or you can handwrite it and then scan it into the Google Classroom. So you're going to pick 2 organisms and then do basically what I did. Write down how these 2 organisms are similar through genetics, through metabolic processes, through areas that they live, to kind of prove that there is common ancestry. Okay, after that, you have a chapter 2 textbook summary and learn smart as your homework. It is not due on Friday. It is going to be due the following Tuesday. So you have a little bit longer to kind of go through the material and learn it and answer questions about it. So that's all I have for today. I'll probably see you during office hours, or if not during office hours, then I will see you on Friday.